Thank you so much for joining us in this somewhat eerie weather. We really appreciate you coming out and joining us at the Mount. My name is Sarah Margolis-Paniu. I'm the Director of Programs here, and I'm delighted to welcome to you to Enslavement and Freedom, Elizabeth Freeman and the American Revolution. Just curious, is this anyone's first time at the Mount in the crowd? Couple of you? Good. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed our exhibit open house for those of you who made the time to attend. If you didn't make it this afternoon between 4 and 5, my colleague Susan Mount at the Mount Bookstore pop-up table has a number of free passes for house tours. So please go and say hello to her if you'd like to come back and visit us another time. Before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. For those of you who are new here, washrooms are actually located in the building across the lawn, directly behind you. Please silence your cell phones if you haven't already. And you may have noticed that our neighbors at CTSB TV are filming this evening. A recording of this program will be made available through their Spectrum broadcast channel, as well as on YouTube. If you do not want to be filmed tonight, please refrain from participating in the Q&A and direct your questions to our panelists who will be available after the program this evening. To introduce our panel tonight, I'm delighted to welcome the organizer of this evening and my becoming frequent collaborator, which is wonderful, Dr. Marcus P. Smith, historian and curator of the W.E.B. Du Bois Freedom Center in Great Barrington. Marcus is also the founder of the Black Grassroots Heritage Preservation Network, a digital storytelling, advocacy, and interactive mapping platform that amplifies Black preservationist voices and community-led projects. Please check out that website. Now, please join me in welcoming Marcus Smith.
Good evening, everyone. I love the call and response. I love it. Well, first thing I want to say is that I am overjoyed to see so many people coming here to stand in support of the figure known as Elizabeth Freeman, who we'll be discussing tonight. On behalf of the Center, I want to thank the Mount for graciously hosting this event's conversation and recognize the organization whose work has helped bring us together, the Berkshire Historical Society, Massachusetts Women's History Center, trustees of reservations, Slavery North, and all of our supporters who have helped make this evening possible. We are grateful to each of them and to all of you for joining us for what promises to be a thoughtful and meaningful discussion. At the Du Bois Freedom Center, we are working to restore the historic Clinton AME Zion Church, established in 1883, as a visitor center and a hub for African American heritage across the Berkshires. But while Du Bois remains central to our mission, we believe preserving Black history in the Berkshires means telling not one story, but many. Elizabeth Freeman's story is one of those stories. It reminds us that the history of this region is inseparable from the broader struggles for freedom, justice, and equality in America. And few figures better illustrate the depth, resilience, and enduring significance of Black history in the Berkshires than Elizabeth Freeman. In 1781, inspired by the promise of liberty enshrined in the Massachusetts Constitution, adopted the previous year, Elizabeth Freeman resolved to claim that promise for herself. Determined to put those ideals to the test, she embarked on a miles-long journey from the Ashley household in Sheffield to Stockbridge, where she enlisted the support of attorney Theodore Sedgwick to bring suit against her slaver, Colonel John Ashley. Together, Freeman and Brom, another person enslaved by Ashley, challenged their enslavement in the case that can be known as Brom and Bett versus Ashley. The victory in Brom and Bett versus Ashley was far more than a legal triumph. Alongside the subsequent Walker cases, the decision helped establish the constitutional foundation for the judicial abolition of slavery in Massachusetts. But for Elizabeth Freeman, the lawsuit was not an ending. It was the beginning of a new chapter in a life already marked by extraordinary courage. Long before she claimed her freedom, she had demonstrated that courage as a steadfast defender of children. In the years that followed, she became widely respected as a healer, nurse, and midwife, earning trust of her community through a life defined by dignity, service, and care for others. To remember Elizabeth Freeman fully is to recognize not only her legal victory, but also the remarkable life she forged in freedom. Perhaps no words better capture the spirit of Elizabeth Freeman than those long attributed to her. Any time while I was a slave, if 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me, and I had been told I must die at the end of that minute, I would have taken just to stand 1 minute on God's earth, a free woman. I would. Those words remind us that freedom is not an abstraction. It is something people have struggled for, sacrificed for, and risked everything to claim. Her footsteps, both literal and symbolic, still stretch across the Berkshires. They began with what has long been remembered as her miles-long journey from Sheffield to Stockbridge, a journey of courage that set in motion a freedom suit that would become the most consequential in American history. They continued to the courthouse in Great Barrington where Brom and Bett versus Ashley was adjudicated, and where Freeman's determination to claim her freedom was affirmed in a legal victory. Today, those footsteps continue to echo far beyond the Berkshires, through the work of scholars, educators, preservationists, and communities who continue to preserve, interpret, and share her remarkable story, including the monument that stands in Sheffield, and the presence of her story and likeness in the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Elizabeth Freeman did not wait for her freedom to be granted to her. She claimed it. And in doing so, she demonstrated what it meant to insist that promises of liberty be applied in practice, not merely proclaimed in principle. More than 2 centuries after Elizabeth Freeman claimed her freedom, her story continues to challenge us to think more deeply about justice, freedom, memory, and the meaning of liberty itself. This evening, we're honored to explore those questions with an extraordinary panel of scholars, historians, and practitioners whose research, teaching, preservation, and interpretation work continue to deepen our understanding of her life and legacy. Please join me in welcoming Freddie DeKay, founder and president of the Massachusetts Women's History Center, Jenna Lays, education coordinator for the Berkshire Historical Society, and co-author of A Free Woman on God's Earth, The True Story of Elizabeth Mum Bett Freeman, Dr. Martha J. McNamara, associate professor of history at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and associate director of Slavery North, and Olivia Libby Scott, director of Arts Trust Fellow at the Cornwall John Ashley House with the trustees of reservations. Thank you. I get to sit. Yo. So I first want to begin, to get us started, to invite each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, the work of their organization or they've undertaken personally. Every organization gathered here today has approached Elizabeth Freeman's legacy from a different perspective, through scholarship, education, preservation, or public interpretation. Can you tell us about your work and how it helps connect us to Freeman and better understand the broader history of enslavement in Massachusetts? And Livy, from the left, I'd like to start with you.
Great. Oh, great. Thanks, Marcus. Hi, everyone. Make it a little closer. My name's Libby Scott. I'm so happy to be here today. I've had the privilege from 2023 to 2025 to be the curatorial fellow funded by the Decorative Arts Trust Peggy and Gary Curatorial Fellowship Program at the Ashley House, Colonel John Ashley House, with the trustees of reservations. The Colonel John Ashley House, for those of you who have not visited and aren't familiar with it, is where Elizabeth Freeman was enslaved to Colonel John Ashley and his wife, Hannah Hooga Boone Ashley. Over my 2 years at the Ashley House, we underwent a reinterpretation, and we focused on dispelling some of the mythologization and misinformation that has become normalized surrounding Elizabeth Freeman, and also clarifying what can be historically known about her and expanding our understanding of what slavery would look like within the Ashley House. We're really pleased with our new exhibition in our interpretation center, and that is open year-round. We welcome all to come visit. We also have wonderful tours, which I'm currently staying on with the trustees for the summer, continuing on in my role, which will be currently rewritten for the next summer season. But the current tours are wonderful, and we have a great exhibition also inside the house highlighting those who were also enslaved alongside Elizabeth Freeman. I had the opportunity during my time with the trustees to do some more research into what enslavement and who actually was enslaved within the Ashley House. We've learned that the numbers were much larger than previously known. I did research with over 25 surviving account books. 3 are held at the Trustees Archive Center, and the remainder are held by the Sheffield Historical Society. That research has allowed me and the trustees to reinterpret the house, and we now know that at least 7 people were enslaved within the Ashley House. And at least two other more people were coercively indentured after the end of slavery, meaning that they were purchased, they were enslaved in New York or Connecticut, and they were indentured or purchased out of slavery by the Ashley family and continued to be in some kind of bondage after the end of slavery. So, as I'm sure we're going to discuss today, the end of slavery was not an end-all be-all in Massachusetts, and it's much more complicated than just a hard stop end. But I'm excited to continue that work on finding more out about the Black communities in Sheffield with my ongoing work with the Sheffield Historical Society and our Mass Communities Funded project. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Thank you. Thank you, Marcus, for inviting me. I'm so honored to be here. I am the writer in residence emeritus and the education coordinator at Berkshire Historical Society, which is at Herman Melville's Arrowhead home. And I wrote this book, I co-authored this book, A Free Woman on God's Earth, the true story of Elizabeth Mum Bett Freeman. Way back, it was published in 2009, before I even got to Arrowhead. But now that I'm there, I do all kinds of workshops with children and adults. I go into schools and we teach about Melville, of course, and we also teach about Elizabeth Freeman because she's a very integral part of Berkshire history and a very important story. So I go into mainly 3rd, 4th grade, and I spend 6 weeks with each class, and we just get into really deep discussions about freedom and slavery and this remarkable woman. So that's what I've been doing, and just spreading the story as far and wide as possible.
Hi, I'm Martha McNamara, and I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And there I am also associate director of Slavery North Initiative, which is a program, a center to study the history, impact, and legacy of slavery in the northern United States and Canada. I have my specialty is the visual and material culture of New England, and I'm specifically interested in the 18th and the 19th centuries. And a current project that I'm working on has brought me into also the study of slavery. I became involved in thinking about Elizabeth Freeman when Marcus Smith invited me and a colleague from UMass to help advise on a project that's going to be a public history installation in Great Barrington at the site of the courthouse where Brom and Elizabeth Freeman's trial took place. And Marcus and John Lloyd had the great idea of connecting with illustration students at Mass College of Art to create depictions of Elizabeth Freeman, both a portrait of her and a depiction of her in the courtroom. And you can see both of the ones that we chose as the sort of leading examples on this flyer that is at the front of the tent there. So I'm delighted to be here to talk about Elizabeth Freeman with a great panel, and I have to say thank you to Marcus and the Du Bois Freedom Center for pulling this together. Elizabeth Freeman is getting a lot of airtime these days, and I think it's about time. So I'm excited that we're doing this. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Freddie Kay. I am the founder and the president of the Massachusetts Women's History Center. These wonderful women are your scholars. I'm not a scholar. I'm a retired attorney. And if you look at my resume on our website, you might wonder, so why is she running the Mass Women's History Center? It was a great passion of mine, frankly, from college days, and I went off and had my career in public policy and law, but sort of woke up around 2010 to say, where are we? Where are we? And I just felt so angry and stunned at the progress that had not been made. Yes, tremendous progress, no doubt about it, and yet so far from being there, if you were, in terms of equality. So in 2010, I'll tell you a brief history of how did the Massachusetts Women's History Center come to be. I'll be quick about it. I don't want to take too much time, but just to say that it started in 2010 to commemorate the 90th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And as you know, the 19th Amendment, which enabled women to vote, does not discriminate in its language, but we wanted to amplify the other laws that were preventing Native American women from voting, Asian American, African American women, these other laws that had to change in order for the 19th Amendment to apply to them because they weren't considered citizens, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those are things that we amplified. And we started off with an event at the Institute of Contemporary Art, the ICA, with the showing of the film Iron Jawed Angels. And if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to look it up. It's actually listed on our website. It's an HBO film about the 19th Amendment. And the story is actually the one that has now come to light again through the musical SUFS, S-U-F-F-S, for the suffragists. PBS, check it out on PBS and elsewhere. Fast forward, we do an annual event at the Swan Boats in Boston. I'm pleased we do it for the Women's Equality Day, which Bella Abzug, many of you may remember Bella Abzug, when she was in Congress, she was upset that August 26th, which is the day that the 19th Amendment was actually added to the Constitution, was not celebrated. So she got it passed through Congress. It's called Women's Equality Day. It's not a formal national holiday, so many of us still haven't heard about it. So our group and some others came together to amplify Women's Equality Day, which we do every year at noon on August 26th, free and open to the public. And we're thrilled that we put votes for women's sashes on the swans, which is really, really fun. There's a feminist story about the swan boats, but I won't go there now. And just say we kept moving forward, focusing on 2020, which would be the anniversary, 2019, a big event at Faneuil Hall, which was wonderful. A lot of that's all online and YouTube with the Boston Children's Chorus, et cetera, et cetera. And then in 2020, for the centennial, we had reserved space on the lawn at Boston Common for a huge march. I'll back up a month to say that in January, we were able to be in Pasadena at the Rose Bowl Parade. A senior citizen woman who was from Rochester, New York originally said, we need a float at the parade. And so they did. It cost about $300,000. It was the Statue of Liberty with descendants of the suffragists on the float and 100 of us in white walking in the back. I had the honor of representing Massachusetts. So that was great. We got that in before the pandemic. Pandemic hits, no marches in Massachusetts. So we have a 30-minute film. It's Lemonade out of Women's Rights. So we have a 30-minute film online that we encourage you to watch, and there are carts in the back, and it's all online. And then the question was, should we stay open? There were some suffrage organizations that were closing. We had a meeting. We have over 200 nonprofit partners. We don't charge. It's just to come together and share information. We had Zoom meetings. So we had Hollywood Squares where we met and decided, no, we don't want to close. People still don't know this story. And you mentioned public history. That's what we're about, is trying to make this history accessible to the public. And we felt like people still don't know these stories. So we broadened our scope to the Massachusetts Women's History Center. It's virtual, it's all online. We hope to have a spot on the Freedom Trail in Boston, so stay tuned. And we also created the Massachusetts Women's Hall of Fame. 17 other states have one. We don't in Massachusetts. That was like, what? So we created one, and we're just about to be releasing our first class. It was, announcements were online and publicized. We had, many nominations. I think it was well over 100. And we're going to be announcing there will be 2 groups in this first class. For the historic group that will be dedicated to women of the American Revolution. Because it's 2026, we know we're going to talk about a lot of the men. We want to be sure to talk about the women during the Revolutionary period. And yes, that would include Elizabeth Freeman. And then there's another category for women who are living. So I'm pleased to show, we put together a coloring book recently, and it just so happened, it was important to me, frankly, to put Elizabeth Freeman on the cover of our coloring book. So, I will stop there. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sweet. Doug.
So I want to say very briefly, really briefly, how I came to live. Funny, so I'm in Great Barrington now, working as a deputy director of the Voice Freedom Center. But what most people might not know, it actually began with Elizabeth Freeman. Elizabeth Freeman is the reason why I'm here, because I was in a public history course 3 years ago, and one of the things that's required of us is to do 300 hours of hands-on work. The Voice Freedom Center reached out, and they said that we want to do an exhibit on Elizabeth Freeman. So myself and 4 other students, we worked on the initial exhibit text for her, for the Great Barrington, which was what this artwork and what Dr. McNamara is referring to. And I got the bug ever since. So it's amazing not only to begin our work with Elizabeth Freeman 3 years ago, but to be sitting here in front of you now and to finally see that work come to fruition. And we're looking to talk more about that in the very first slide, or the next slide as I mentioned. Whatever it turns, got it. Is the artwork that we're going to be showing. So I want to get straight into the conversation in that Elizabeth Freeman kind of left this mark on history, and you all kind of touched it on a certain way, is that why do you think that her story's been overlooked for so long, and why do you think that this moment is when so many people are discovering her life and legacy and looking to celebrate, even as testimonies are sitting here, if anyone wants to speak to that?
I would love to speak to that. I'll tell a little origin story of how I found out about her, and this book was written. So it was about 2001 when I was teaching. I'm a teacher. I was teaching English to students in Pittsfield County School. Many students were from Africa. Some were from North America, etc., and Asia. But it was Black History Month, which of course I believe should be, all the time. But, and I was wanting to come up with a historical figure that was local and that I could really, talk to the children about. And I didn't really know, we've done with Martin Luther King, of course, and Sojourner Truth, etc. And this is a true story. I was driving through through Stockbridge, and the name Mum Bett came into my head, and I said, I don't know why this name is in my head. So I went to the librarian and I said, have you ever heard of someone named Mum Bett? Because I knew something was very famous about her, or something was very important about her. And my librarian said, Elizabeth Freeman, yeah, there's a center here named after her in Pittsfield. And I said, well, I want to read for my children. Is there a book about her? And she said, well, let me look. There was no book about her, nowhere. And the internet was brand new, and she looked on the internet and there was no book. And I was a new writer with my first book out. And I said, well, I want to write a book about her. But how do you write a book about someone you know nothing about? And that day, this is a true story, on my email, there was a professional development email that said, Anne Elizabeth Barnes, who was a historic site interpreter at the Ashley House, was giving a talk on Elizabeth Mum Bett Freeman that afternoon.
Wow.
And it was at 3 o'clock, and I worked till 3:15. And I very boldly asked my principal if I could leave early. And she said yes. And I left early, and I listened to Anne Elizabeth speak about Elizabeth Freeman, and I was just so inspired. And I said to her, would you like to write a book with me? And she said yes. And the reason that she knew so much, so she was the historic site interpreter in the late 90s. They were not talking at the trustees at the Ashley House. She was a docent, and the tours were about John and Hannah Ashley and the furniture and the writing of the resolves, and nothing about this woman. And on rainy days, she would go up into the archives and she started to read, and she discovered this story, which she said to the trustees, to her bosses, this needs to be the story we tell. It's really important. And they said, go for it. And she did. She changed up the tour, and that is how she developed this program. She developed a program called Mum Bett in the Schools, and she would go to schools in around 2001 or 2000 and start to teach children. And then we wrote this book, and it came out in 2009. But her story was sort of just put aside. I mean, people had known about her, they'd written about her, especially Catherine Maria Sedgwick, Theodore Sedgwick's daughter, who was the first female novelist in the United States. But the story just wasn't out in the world. And she brought it out. And so that's kind of how as far as I know, that's the origin story of how we got started with telling the story to mainly children, because school children didn't know about her, hadn't heard about her. And we thought it was incredibly important that everybody knows this story, because it's a remarkable story.
So to talk to your question about why Elizabeth Freeman wasn't talked about for a long time, wasn't given wasn't highlighted, and now is getting more. I think we have to remember that there's been a real amnesia about slavery in the northern United States. And that when people think about the abolition of slavery, they think about the Emancipation Proclamation, right? They don't really think about how it was that slavery was abolished in the North, because they don't know or don't understand that slavery was very much a powerful institution in the northern states. So that's one reason I think that people haven't really focused on the sort of history and trajectory of slavery and abolition in New England. And then second, I think, there is this been longstanding focus on, the sort of great men of history. And, historians have been pushing back against this, for quite a long time, but it's a kind of easy way for people to think about history is in terms of the founding fathers. And so I think the sort of ordinary people who took part in revolutionary activities of all sorts have not quite gotten the attention. And particularly if you're African American and a woman and living in rural Massachusetts, those are a lot of obstacles to overcome. And I think what's the reason that she's getting more airtime now is because there's a pretty good shift, it seems to me, to thinking about particularly the American Revolution as requiring the founding fathers, the Jeffersons, the Adamses, but also the ordinary people, right? The ordinary people fighting for liberty and fighting for their rights. One last thing I might say about this is that, yes, Catherine Sedgwick had written about Elizabeth Freeman, but in a very romanticized way, and one that I and others would argue really was a way of sort of elevating her own family rather than really focusing on Elizabeth Freeman and her family.
So one of the things I want to ask, following up from that, is, you're kind of speaking to this as well, but so much parts of her life are richly documented. There's always a lot that we don't know. And one of the big questions that tie into that, which is a point of conversation, is there was also Brom, right? And so when we think about the history documentation of her work, how do historians, educators, preservationists navigate these gaps of the historical record and being able to tell her story? And what is that process kind of teaching us about the opportunities and challenges of interpreting the past?
Yeah, I'd love to speak to that. I think one of the tricky things about history is that we have to get uncomfortable with the unknown. Every once in a while I'll give a tour and I talk to people and they're quite often frustrated by how little we know about Elizabeth Freeman, but we know there were probably other Black women enslaved in the Ashley House that we don't even know their names. These historical silences are quite structural in the way that the archive is formed, in the way that records were kept, in the way that the town of Sheffield, did not record a single birth of an enslaved Black person until the end of slavery. So there are real structural reasons why this is happening, that it's so important to acknowledge historically. And it's okay not to have the answer, and we don't necessarily need to fill in the blanks. I think one of the big ones is, who is Brom to her? My research really indicates we cannot conclusively say that was her husband. We don't know who the father of Betsy was. Other ones are, she was born in Claverack, and was enslaved in the Hannah Hoogeboom, Ashley's father's house. Fortunately, those records are written in Dutch. Even with translation, they just largely bunch everyone together and they don't name everyone out. So we can't know for sure. So one of the large things we've been doing in our research is not making these historical jumps, being okay with that uncomfortable, and also not being stuck in the despair, following some of the really wonderful recent transatlantic slavery work by Cydia Hartman, Marissa Fuentes, and understanding why people might be absent, and trying to also find glimpses of them that are empowering and aren't stuck in these moments. And at the same time, not overlooking figures like Brom, because he also was swimming alongside of her, and her exceptionalism doesn't necessarily have to be erasure or displacement for the other people enslaved in the Ashley house, which is why the context is so pivotal. One of my favorite overlooked parts that I like to tell people about is that Elizabeth Freeman was not the only person suing for her freedom at the time in the Ashley house. There was a man named Zach Mullen. Himself and his brother Adam Mullen were enslaved in the house. I was able to find a document that says that they were born in Salisbury, Connecticut. And Zach ends up suing Ashley in very close proximity, and the case was ongoing during Elizabeth Freeman's trial. And they ended up settling out of court. But what was going on during those times? What were the conversations like in the house? Did Elizabeth Freeman and Zach go back to the house? Were they not sleeping in the house while the Freedom Ships were on? These are these tough questions we really want to have answers to, but unfortunately, we've just got to, as I've said, live in that sense of unknown, sometimes with history.
Can I just add on to that? I mean, it's important to realize that the suit is Brom and Bett versus John Ashley. So his name comes first, as we would expect that because he was a man. But I think, so after the trial, Elizabeth Freeman becomes a domestic servant in the household of the Sedgwicks. And they're the ones who write her story, both Catherine, but also I think Henry Dwight Sedgwick writes about her life. Brom didn't have those people, right? We don't really know what happened to him after the suit, is that right?
Yeah, disappears, unfortunately. But the Sedgwicks never do write about him.
Yes, right.
I think the beauty of that story is that when Mum Bett, or Elizabeth, went to the Sedgwick house in Sheffield, she walked the 4 miles. She asked for her freedom, and Theodore Sedgwick said, how did you come to learn of this? And she said, by keeping still and minding things, and I want my freedom. I'm one of the nation. And he said, well, he considered, her plea, and he said, well, you can't do anything because you're a woman. You have to find a man to sue along with you. And that is when she asked Brom, as far as I know. And Brom was enslaved at General Ashley's home, which is Colonel Ashley's son. And according to the records that we found, that he was treated very badly. His owner took after his mother, which is Hannah Ashley, who was quite, had some, she was a little violent and not a very nice person. And so that was, so Brom was convinced, she convinced him to sue along with her. And as far as we know, he went back to General Ashley after he was freed, but knowing that he was a free person and would be paid for his work, for his service.
Just to clarify quickly, based on my research, Brom was definitely enslaved to Colonel Ashley. We have documentary evidence of him working for Ashley throughout his account book. Brom also does not continue to work for Colonel Ashley or General Ashley after their death. He truly disappears. I also just want to clarify that we don't know if that's how those conversations went. We have no records of there have been ideas that, it was Brom's idea, there have been things said that it might be Theodore Sedgwick's. We have no idea how Elizabeth Freeman came to be a part of this freedom suit. And certainly not that she convinced Brom. That's one of those slight historical jumps, in my opinion.
I think this does raise an important question in that how can we work to interpret her character, right? The things we do know in terms of, okay, she took the hit from the hot shovel, right, in order to protect the child. We have this record of her, showing her scar, and when people were asking her about that she got from the shovel, they said, "Ask Mrs. Ashley." And so we're in this space where for many people, she is an inspirational figure. And so how do you balance the character interpretation, historical storytelling, with also those historical gaps? Because what I'm also hearing as well is that even though we don't have the entire story, absence could also teach a lot as well.
Yep.
Everyone has a thought now. Other question.
It is the one thing that we can do, of course, is to look at scholarship that has been written on slavery in New England and on midwives in New England and on freedom suits, right? And put these stories in a broader context. So, for instance, Elizabeth Freeman, she wins her freedom in that trial. But that's a local trial, right? It's in the Court of Common Pleas in Berkshire County. Looks the county was still Hampshire then. It was Berkshire.
Yeah.
It was Berkshire, right? But that's where it didn't go. It was never appealed up to the Supreme Judicial Court. Amazingly, there's another case happening about the same time, 1781, the Quock Walker case. And he lives in Worcester, and he also sues for his freedom. That does get appealed, and up to the state Supreme Court. It is Chief Justice William Cushing who writes the opinion that slavery is incompatible with the Massachusetts state constitution. Maybe that's part of another reason why Elizabeth Freeman gets forgotten, but I think we also need to keep the even broader context. So there's this context of these freedom suits, right after 1780, right after the state constitution is written. But then there's also this broader context of African Americans pushing for their freedom back to the mid-18th century, right? Petitioning the Massachusetts provincial government for their freedom. There's a whole line of petitions, and these petitions are amazing because they're drawing on that Enlightenment language of freedom and human rights. And then there's also some recent work by a historian at the University of Michigan, Gloria Whiting, who finds that in fact, on a kind of even more sort of grassroots level, African Americans are pushing for their freedom with their enslavers. So finding ways to buy their freedom or to become manumitted. So it's important, I think, to keep those larger contexts in mind. And then again, there's been a lot of work done on midwifery in the 18th century, and I think that's a place where we can really think about Elizabeth Freeman when she's in Stockbridge and working for the Sedgwicks, but is also, as I understand it, a healer and a midwife in the community. It would be great to think, take this work that's been done by other scholars and think about where Elizabeth Freeman might fit in there. I think that's a historian's way of dealing with the gaps.
Yeah. And I want to zoom out for 1 second, because I think we're talking about the challenges of accuracy and interpretation, but I also want to speak also to the work that everyone has done in their own way to amplify Elizabeth Freeman's story beyond the regional limits that were first described in the first question. And so I wonder if you could all kind of touch a bit more about how you've amplified their stories and why it's important to do so. And once again, kind of seeing the broader changes you've seen over this last decade even. I think that's a competence work.
I'd be happy to talk about that. I'm trying to remember how I first learned about Elizabeth Freeman, and I'm not exactly sure. It could be that we have some curators who have written our biographies, our exhibits, and articles, and I think probably our curator came and said we really ought to write about Elizabeth Freeman. So you'll find on our website a biography about Elizabeth Freeman, and I know for me, I just felt like this is such a compelling story along with all these others where I felt like nobody knows the story of fill in the blank. I have many, particularly the suffrage movement, but Elizabeth Freeman was one that I just thought was incredibly compelling. So in addition to a biography, when we decided to do our coloring book, frankly, I insisted that she be on the cover. We have 14 artists who did these, thought this was a terrific drawing that she did. It's really compelling. And this was an opportunity to amplify her story as well as on our online piece. Thank you.
Good.
So for us, after the book came out in 2009, we started a Mum Bett Walk to Freedom in 2010, and it's been going strong for the past 15 years. And we walk 4 miles. We walk from the Ashley House to the Sedgwick House in Sheffield, which is the house that's right across from the statue in Sheffield. And we talk about her, we tell her story. And in the past, we've had an actress named Tammy Denise, who is an African-American actress, and she does hidden women, hidden figures in history, and she portrays Mum Bett, and she's given, wonderful performances. And then we had Smitty Pignatelli, our state representative, or former, and he reads the resolution, which I have right here. And in fact, Smitty, Tammy Denise, and I took the story to the State House in Boston, and we told the story, and they did not, none of the representatives had ever heard the story, and they were shocked. They had no idea. So we're doing whatever we can. This book has also been optioned to be a film, which has been in the works for years and years. So yeah, still not happened, but maybe it will. We're definitely trying to get this story out into your world in a broader sense, but we definitely want to keep it, we want it to be Berkshire known. So our goal is to get this book into the hands of every child in Berkshire County. That's really what we want to do.
And I'll testify, the first time I learned about Elizabeth Freeman was actually at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History and Culture. I walked in there and said, who is this? And I put in my notebook and, kept moving forward. That was before I started the PhD program. And so coming back now, I was like, oh, that's who they're talking about. This is who they're showcasing. It was also a wonderful task. I would love to learn about, and it feels strange to say how they knew about it, but why they also thought it was so important to include her in their national story as well. So it really kind of showcased to me that there's something really significant here that we really have to dive deep
And
into.
her quote is in the rotunda for the Charters of Freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Flashing to see that at the museum in Washington. This Smithsonian, where you go down the banister, and then there are 2 huge statues, Elizabeth Freeman and Phyllis Wheatley.
Yeah.
And it's really impressive. It really does good.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always, as I've been here for the last year, I'm always excited and impressed to learn how much Black history is in the Berkshire. I mean, we had the wonderful event about Vandersea last week. We have W. Du Bois, we have James Weldon Johnson, we have Elizabeth Freeman, and there's just something about the Berkshires that has always been so rich with respect to that. And in thinking about, and I want to come back to something that was kind of touched on that I really love to expand on, is this idea about enslavement in the North and misconceptions people might have. And so the question is, what do audiences need to understand about slavery in 18th century Massachusetts, and what misconceptions about slavery in New England still persist?
You still meet people who say slavery didn't exist in the North. There's a sense of collective amnesia about it, but there's also a lot of misinformation about what freedom suits were. I read somebody posted something about Elizabeth Freeman and said that she was the first freedom suit in Massachusetts. Certainly not true. There were so many brave men and women and children who sued for their freedom long before her. But I think one of the big things we've really focused on at the trustees is that there's a lack of scholarship on slavery in Western Massachusetts, or generally in more rural areas. We have a lot more to learn about it. I'm a huge fan of Gloria Whiting, who you recently mentioned. She's published some really interesting new scholarship on just what it meant to be a Black woman in an enslaved household, and helped us understand what it really meant to live like that. But most of those examples are primarily in Boston, where we have a much greater documentary record. So we have a lot more research to do and a lot more.
No.
Especially in our really little unique corner of the world, we are such a microcosm of New York, Connecticut. There was so much intercolony trading and so much intercolonial enslaved people purchasing and selling. It was really fluid across state lines, and it really did shape the character of what slavery looked like in the Berkshires in a very, very different way than Boston. So I think we've still got a lot to learn. I'm hoping that we can all help contribute to that effort. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. I would also say that, you know, New England was able to claim the mantle of abolitionism, right, in the early to mid 19th century, and that has been sort of the mythos for New England. And that has kind of contributed to the amnesia that I talked about, of the erasure of the existence of slavery. The other thing that happens is that as compared to what gets described as plantation slavery in the South, there's often this argument that New England slavery wasn't as bad, right? And I think even Catherine Mariah Sedgwick says as much, right? Well, and that of course is a complete misconception, right? Because there was as much violence and sexual predation and torture, really, in New England as there was on plantations in the South. In many ways, in some ways, New England, particularly rural New England, it was much more difficult, right? Because you might be a single enslaved person in a rural household, highly isolated, right? Boston was better, and I think that's one of the things that Gloria Whiting's work brings out, is that there's much more fluidity from among households, and so the African American community has a little bit more of a sense of community there. But particularly in rural areas, it can be very isolated. It could be very isolating and quite terrifying. One last thing I'll say on this point, and that is that New England's economy rested on the slave trade and on the slave goods produced in the South. It was New England, northern mostly New England, merchants and bankers who financed the slave trading ships, who financed cotton plantations into the 19th century. So these economies were thoroughly entwined. There were shoes made in Worcester County that were shipped by the thousands to be given to enslaved people on southern plantations. So even the mill work here, the early industrialization, the products that were produced were meant to support the slave economy. And I think that's another aspect of slavery in New England that's a huge misconception, that somehow the North and New England were particularly abolitionist and were not really involved at all in slavery. Nothing could be further from that truth.
Good. So I want to follow up on this, and we were having a conversation prior to the panel started, is that oftentimes we can reduce these Black historical figures who are attached to court cases to just their name in the court case, right? As an example, many people are familiar with the 1896 court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, right? But we have to ask ourselves the question, who was Homer Plessy? And who is his full life? And so now I want to turn to Elizabeth Freeman after enslavement. Specifically, what aspects, can we speak to her life after enslavement? And with the best we have of our historical knowledge and interpretation, what can that tell us about who she was, and what resonates with you about what we know about her, how you understand her?
One of, I think, the most powerful sources we have for really hearing Elizabeth Freeman's own voice is her probate inventory and her will. So she dictates it to somebody else, but it's probably the only real firsthand account we have in her own words. And within that inventory, I find it so powerful that she records and gives to her daughter Betsy one gown received from my father, one short gown that was my mother's. It's such a tribute to the persistence of Black familial ties, regardless of separation of distance. and ongoing familial genealogy. We don't know. It is possible that Elizabeth Freeman's parents were enslaved in the Ashley house. We don't have any records that go back that far into the 1730s, but per se, if the Claverack theory is correct, she was maintaining ties to that community, or those were items gifted to her before she was sold to Ashley. And we do see that with other previously enslaved people in the Ashley house. We have Harry, who after his freedom continually goes back and forth to Claverack. The Mullen brothers go to Salisbury quite often, where they at least probably have, we know their grandparents were there, but probably other parents and other siblings. So I think that's a really beautiful testament to life after slavery, and just really looking at the life she built for herself in Stockbridge.
Yeah.
Well, she also was a midwife. She earned money that way, and she had enough money that she bought a plot of land on Cherry Hill. She bought, I think, 12 acres overlooking Agawam Pond, and that's where she built her little, as Catherine calls it, a hut. But she lived there. She was a free woman for over 50 years. So she did a lot, and she raised the Sedgwick children, along with birthing many, many children. And the quote that we know, and I don't know if it's true, but she says, I never lost a baby in the birthing. So she's very proud of her midwifery skills.
And Olivia, what I remember from the will and the probate too is that she's not only making bequests to her daughter, but also to her grandchild and her great-grandchildren. So she really is, it's a kind of future-looking to establish that lineage going forward. That's really very moving, and something that is, we all want to do for our children, right? Is to set them up and have them as a way to continue and to thrive. So that I think really comes through in the will and probate as well.
Good.
And Freddie, you mentioned being inspired a few times about Elizabeth Freeman's story. And what stuck out to you that you felt particularly resonant?
I think learning that she could not read or write, and yet was absorbing what she was hearing. And I know there are different accounts about how she came to learn about the Massachusetts Constitution, and of course the documents that came before that. But she absorbed and knew that this was not applying to her, and it didn't make any sense. And the fact that she had the courage and the wherewithal to say, what about me? Like, who are you talking to? And I think it's interesting. I've known for years about this walk that she took 4 miles to go to Sedgwick's house. And I remember thinking, she was a slave just to be able to find a way to walk and be out of the house for 4 miles. That wasn't easy either. So she couldn't just decide like, oh, I'm just going to go walk over to his house and be gone for some period of time, and knowing how mistreated she was, that was a scary thing to do, just to take that walk, much less could she convince him to take her case. And I expect she knew that he was a slave owner. He enslaved at least one person that we know. And I found that amazing. So the fact that she had the courage to do all that, and to have the presence of mind to say, I'm going to speak up for myself and my people, and go try to pursue this.
Yeah.
That is incredible bravery.
And one thing that's really resonated and stuck out with me over the course of several comments you've all made is that it really understanding how you situate Elizabeth Freeman within a broader Black community that existed, right? It's not just one enslaved woman. There's families, there's friends, people who are also probably attentive to the outcomes of her case, right? And what that might have manifested, what it hoped for. And you've touched on this, so I was going to ask you also speak a little bit more about this broader Black community that existed in the Berkshires, and I think particularly Stockbridge.
So there was a really, really strong free Black community in Stockbridge even before the end of slavery. Certainly the strongest in the Berkshires. Many well-known figures like Agrippa Hull, Coffee, Nana. Many people dating back to even to the founding of Stockbridge as a community. Sheffield was a little less so. there's one prominent free black man in Sheffield before the end of slavery named Caesar Piriami. And then we found that the enslaved population in Sheffield was much larger. But as we've noted, there were great distances between the houses, and there would have been a sense of isolation, and people were maintaining often closer ties, towns like Salisbury and Canaan, than they were to Stockbridge. But so this move for Elizabeth Freeman must have been quite a change. There was a established land-owning free black community in a way that the Sheffield community, it took certainly a few years to establish a foothold after they were freed with no possessions, no money, and often no possessions and no money, and nothing paid back for their continual labor. So moving to Stockbridge must have been in meeting Enoch Humphrey, whose son Jonah marries her daughter, and it ends up being, it seems to really integrate herself, and she, as by all accounts, becomes a very, very well-respected woman in town. And it is the second largest landowner in Stockbridge by the midpoint in her life, a black landowner. Sorry if I didn't clarify that. And by the end of her life.
Yeah. And so, excuse me. So one of the things I'm curious about as well from your perspective is how do we think about her story in terms of contemporary relevance? I mean, how does her life continue to challenge us? What does it teach us about liberty and equality that also kind of speaks for this unfinished work of fulfilling those ideals within our society?
Well, I think she spoke truth to power, and that was so incredibly important. When I do school visits, and you can see there's some artwork over there that I brought with me from some of the visits, and the kids are so inspired because she was so brave. She spoke truth. She didn't, she stood her ground. And I think that's really important. She lived by her convictions.
Yeah.
And that's critically important.
Yeah. And I think it speaks to that idea is how do we ensure commemoration also encourages learning, not just celebration? How can we walk away having some discussions like this or interpretive materials? So what do you think about the effort to, or what do we need to be mindful of and responsible when we try to commemorate Elizabeth Freeman or when we discuss her events?
Go ahead. What do you
I think what's so interesting is by bringing her story to life, which has not been known for a long time, that it reduces the amount of time. I think it becomes one where it's like, that's not that long ago. Yes, it was hundreds of years, whatever. But the fact that we can know these details, thanks to these wonderful scholars, that it can become more real for us and to see the connection with the issues that we're dealing with today, frankly. And so I think that it's really, really important that we amplify these stories so that people come to know about it and recognize that we are still in the story. It hasn't ended. And so we need to keep going. And I feel, pardon me for one moment, I'm thinking of, for those of you who may have seen the Broadway show SUFS, S-U-F-F-S, SUFS, Tour for Suffragists. Wonderful stories in there of African-American women included. It's on PBS. It may have ended. Great performances. So definitely look it up. But there are lots of banners. So we often wear votes for women's sessions, but I brought this one from SUFS, which is called Keep Marching. No, Keep Marching.
Yeah, and I just want to amplify what Freddie said about the relevance, right? Particularly in this 250th commemoration year of the Revolution. We are still arguing over the ideals and ideas of the Revolution. And in many ways, we are, still it's an unfinished revolution, right? And just the classic one that I think Elizabeth Freeman's story speaks to is this fundamental question: who is the we in we the people? How do we draw that circle? Does it include Elizabeth Freeman? Well, we would all say now, well, of course it does. But we can think, right, about people who are being excluded from that circle of we, and how we are having, very heated, often, discussions and debates about who gets to be an American.
And Libby said there were many, she was not the first person to sue for freedom. People were suing from the time they arrived here. But she was the first person to use the words of the Massachusetts Constitution, which said all men are created free and equal. And that's what makes her so important.
Cool. You know, we have this challenge I want to speak to, this balance between historical accuracy and interpretation. You know, right now, the Du Bois Freedom Center is opening an exhibit at our 309 Main Street in Great Barrington, which features illustrations from 16 students at the Massachusetts College of Art who are all interpreting their own style, through which Dr. McNamara was referencing were participatory. And we always face that challenge, right? Would she have been in the courtroom? Would a courtroom, even that, right? Would there have been that many windows? Would her dress be looking this way? And we don't have a surviving image of the Great Barrington courthouse, actually, where it's even adjudicated. And so we're thinking, how do we render the interior properly? And then we have, even in our artwork, right, she's wearing the gold beads, which she wouldn't probably have had at that point at that age. But it's a signifier that people are able to recognize her by for those familiar with her story. And so we're always having this challenge between what is the most historically accurate versus what is the most compelling and representative. And I'm curious how people on this panel have confronted that challenge and navigated that, and what the reflections might be on that.
Marcus, do you have the historic image of Elizabeth Freeman?
It's in our. We have a.
But we don't have it. We don't have it.
No, not displayed.
We have it on our, we have a flyer in the back that has that.
Yes.
So we have an image, a small watercolor of a miniature portrait of Elizabeth Freeman, which is just crazy rare, right? To have an image of an African American woman from the early 19th century. So it's great that it survives. But it depicts her as an elderly woman, right? And one of the things that we worked on with the students was how to depict her as a much younger woman. I think she was maybe 30 during the time of the suit. And how we can, portray her as a kind of vibrant, younger woman, when the only image we have is this one when she was much older. And I think, to Marcus's point about having to strike a balance in the images, we wanted to be sure that we paid attention to the fact that, a 18th century courtroom was a place of incredible hierarchy, right? And you had to show tremendous deference, not only to the judges, but all the elites who would gather in that courtroom. So, we had to strike a balance between Elizabeth Freeman both being quasi-deferential, but also kind of assertive, right? Because that's our sense of her. So the students had to go back and forth a couple of times. There was one I remember Marcus said, "She looks like she's going to throw a punch. I don't think that's going to work." Other things, Marcus mentions the beaded necklace that she's wearing in the image that was chosen of the portrait that the student did. She wasn't given that necklace until she was much older. It was given to her by Theodore Sedgwick. So there's a little bit of an anachronism there, but as Marcus said, it's really a signifier of her. I mean, people have come to expect seeing Elizabeth Freeman with that gold bead and with the scarf on her arm as well, which would have been there during the trial. But it speaks, Marcus, also to one of the problems of commemoration is that they do tend to sort of stick people in time, right? So to your point that, how do we see historical figures as humans living complex, nuanced, and ever-changing lives, right? How do we do that and yet also commemorate the things that she did?
We also, when we have 42 illustrations in this book. And Jacqueline Rogers is a very well-known illustrator, and we told her, that one image of Elizabeth Freeman, she's 80 years old. It's not particularly attractive, but we said she's beautiful. We want to make her beautiful, and I feel like we did, and we portrayed Many, many images in this book. And even we went to the Sedgwick house in Sheffield, and Jackie, sketched the staircase, and, we tried to make it as authentic as we possibly could. And in terms of the trial, and when we wrote the script, also, we were trying to figure out, where would she be in the courthouse? And, some of the writers said she should speak. And we don't think she spoke. No, they were like, let's keep it historically accurate. She didn't, she probably wanted to say something, but she didn't.
Can I build on that if I might? So you're reminding me that when we got these sketches, the first draft of the sketch of Elizabeth Freeman had her in the courtroom speaking. And I remember going, whoa, I don't think she had the right. So we went down the hall, we tried to look it up and see, but I knew that we know that she had gone to Attorney Sedgwick and talked to him. And so because of that, we were able to have her speaking to him and wanted to be sure that we were accurate about that.
Yeah, and as Olivia, as you spoke to, it's been interesting. We've been in our tours at Great Barrington. We also met my friend Elizabeth Freeman. And it's been so interesting to be giving a tour saying, likely, probably, by our best estimations. It was like, and like I said, and some people are freshly, but I love how people had answered that question on this panel, saying that, we can learn so much from why we don't know these things in terms of what we need to correct now and later on. So, yes, it's a fun, challenging, but also been very rewarding to have those conversations with people. And so before we head into our Q&A, I want to ask a final question to the panel. And essentially is if the audience could leave with a lesson today, or if even we could think about Elizabeth Freeman's character, what should we all carry with us when we leave? It's a big question.
Her courage. I mean, that she inspires me. She's my hero. I think about her all the time. I think about her now with what's going on in the country. Just speaking truth to power. To me, that's so important. And it just being brave. And she was.
And I would say that I would like people to take away the understanding that Elizabeth Freeman was one of thousands of enslaved people in New England who were always looking for ways to find their freedom, whether it was by running away from their enslavers or filing petitions or engaging in freedom suits. There was an entire population that was held in bondage and was actively trying to escape that bondage.
I just say one more thing. I think also that one small thing, one person, she changed the course of history. She truly did. So I think, we can all do something. So that's kind of what I hold on to.
Yeah, I love this point earlier that was made about how we should put her into a box and make her just a character. She was a real person with real dimensionality beyond just this one moment in her life that was probably not one that felt great. She was probably terrified. She had a daughter who was still possibly in the Ashley household who could have been taken away from her and they could have been separated. There would have been massive ramifications. So, of course, the bravery, but also this colorful life that she had after and probably during that she lived with other people, at least 7 other people somewhere in the Ashley house, and that we have so much more to learn, and that every single year I hope we can get a little closer.
It's not unfinished.
I would just add, everything you said I think is fantastic, and I would just add what you were talking about of the unknowns and so much we don't know about, is to add that she is an example for so many in the African American community and other communities that we don't know about. And frankly, it's one of the things that motivates us at the Massachusetts Women's History Center, that these stories need to be amplified. And so we're interested in public history so that people generally can learn about this incredible history. And her story is an amazing one we should all know.
Thank you all for that.
If there are questions for the panelists, just a reminder to speak into the mic since we are recording this evening.
What, if any, documents are still exited from that court case? Is it just a reported decision, or are there records of testimonies that was taken?
There's no recorded testimony, unfortunately. There's a couple of different versions of documents with some drafts, with some things crossed out. There is one document, interestingly, that says, gosh, I can't remember the exact date, but it does say a term of time for how long they were enslaved, but it was crossed out. So we aren't sure how factually accurate that is, but unfortunately, no, there's no testimony. But rarely does, only in, I found typically Supreme Court cases during the 18th century preserve more testimony than just county courts.
Charlie, are there any descendants of her family? And do they have stories to tell if there are?
We collaborated with the New England Genealogical Society and 10 Million Names, and they did, I think it was 2024? Yeah, summer 2024, they discovered a descendant of Elizabeth Freeman who was living in the family line goes to Virginia, and she was able to tour the Ashley House, and she said that it felt incredibly powerful to walk on the same floors as her ancestor. She had no idea.
I'm curious about what we might know about Sedgwick's motivation in taking the case and how unusual that might have been.
It's a great question. Sedgwick was young. He was a very aspirational lawyer and politician. So he may have been, this is in that realm of unknown, right? He may have been the person who wanted a test case to test this clause in the state constitution, and he may have identified Brom and Bett as plaintiffs. That would sort of advance his own political and legal career, but we don't know.
He was very ambitious.
He was very ambitious.
I'd like to know what year was slavery abolished in the Commonwealth, and how was it? Was the legislature involved? Was it by court action? Or exactly how did the abolishment of slavery work?
It was 1783 when slavery was abolished in Massachusetts. And according to our information, by 1790, there were no more enslaved people on the census in Massachusetts. I don't know if that's wrong.
Tricky.
So this is a term that I think Marcus used called judicial abolition, right? So the Quock Walker case, which began in 1781 and made it to the Supreme Judicial Court in 1783, that was the case that the Supreme Court Justice said that this was, I'm looking for that, that he evoked what was called the Free and Equal Clause. So basically saying that slavery was incompatible with the state constitution. So that was a judicial abolition. What we find, though, is that freedom is not a bright line, right? Slavery is not a bright line. There were what most formerly enslaved people experienced was not pure freedom, but rather a kind of spectrum between enslavement and freedom, a kind of quasi-freedom, right? They didn't have the access to opportunities. Often they were, I think Livy brought up an example where enslaved people after 1783 were indentured, right? So again, it's much more, we like to think of it as coming to an end, that was it, we're done, but it's much more complicated and much more interesting story than that.
We do, though, find in Sheffield specifically that just building on that, there was evidence that Elizabeth Freeman's case did make an effect on the community pretty directly, pretty quickly. We do, in the tax records, the number of Black people jumps up by 10 directly after her case. So those effects were felt in the community, but it was certainly gradual, and there were certainly people still caught in various forms of bondage, as you mentioned.
I'll have to testify how tricky it was to write an opening statement and nerve-wracking. For a panel of experts, Elizabeth Freeman, it's like, is this the right word? Is this the right way? And I think the fine-tooth comb is one of those difficult but also very revealing challenges.
Thank you for a remarkable program. All 5 of you are so inspiring. I wanted to ask how we could access the filmed version of this panel, of this program.
Yes.
That it will be available on YouTube. We'll send you the info in your follow-up email.
I'm wondering about the fact that she was buried with the Sedgwicks and what you think that says about how they felt about her, the relationship, their motivations. I know somebody said, like, the book that was written by one of the Sedgwicks was sort of self-aggrandizing. So I'm just wondering about all that.
You said it wonderfully, but it is what Catherine Sedgwick wrote is 1 year directly after Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's 2 years after the Runaway Slave Act of 1850. And she does write in the draft, and she says, because everyone's so interested in Uncle Tom's Cabin, so there obviously are massive personal gain reasons and also larger reasons of New England is not as bad as the South in terms of framing, but I think what is clear through all of their work is that they really, really loved her and that she was an important member of their family, regardless of any personal motivations.
Yes.
I also think because she was so self-aware and she wrote this will, she knew what she wanted. I think that she knew this was going to happen. I don't know. But I think that, some people have said, oh, well, she was subjugated in death. I disagree with that. I think if she didn't want to be buried there, she wouldn't fit there. Actually, I feel like her personality and who she was would have objected to that. Of course, I don't know, but that's my feeling.
Yeah, and it's a really compelling but also incredibly complex question, not only in the context of Elizabeth Freeman, but the relationships that people had in terms of being in service to white people at this period in time, right? Like a lot of the times, the relationship that the employers think they have with their servants is far different, right? And it's not a universal every single case. Like, so I'm not saying to diminish the relationship, but I think it opens a question for everyone to explore that relationship a bit more in terms of also, like, what does it mean to be employed by someone and have this relationship, but also necessarily not having the freedom to speak at a risk of losing employment, things like that. So I'll say both in the context of this conversation, but elsewhere, to encourage people to investigate that really complex relationship. And there are a few interesting books, one of them I want to plug, by Fabiola Glymph called Out of the House of Bondage, that also talks about that relationship of what it means to be in a house of enslavement, particularly between servants and the mistresses, which was a key conversation about the Ashleys. So it's a really, really complex subject.
Also, can I just say the big word patriarchy?
Yeah.
So I haven't been to the cemetery, but I've seen images of it and had it described, and it's the Sedgwick pie, apparently. And there's a central monument to Theodore Sedgwick and a smaller monument to his wife. And then all the other Sedgwicks, the descendants, are buried in concentric circles around Theodore Sedgwick's central monument. And Elizabeth Freeman is in one of those circles.
She's right across from Theodore Sedgwick, directly next to Catherine.
He's the senator, so up to you.
Theodore is
No,
Well, he
She is in the center.
yes.
very close to this.
First, Betsy.
Okay.
First of all, thank you again for shining a light on this story. For those of us not familiar with the state constitution, what were the specific arguments that won this case?
So I'm not deeply familiar with the Quogue Walker case. Is that what you're asking about, or the Elizabeth Freeman case? Well, we don't have opinions in these cases because it's the county court. So we don't have any recorded recordings of the arguments or any testimony. So it's very difficult to come up with a clear answer to that question.
Will they give up something to him?
Yeah, totally agree. It seems like it's based on Article 1 that all men are created free and equal, just on a very base level. They probably argued much more nuanced interpretations of the Constitution, but we're not exactly sure.
That classroom back there?
Hi guys, thank you very much. So speaking on behalf of some people that are recognized in the audience, I imagine many of us have read about some of these topics. I know some people have been in book clubs that we meet to learn more. I was just wondering if each of you had, if there was one book that you wished lay people could read to learn more about this topic, the time period. And just to throw out one example, I wish I could remember the title, but there was a book that came to mind when Libby was speaking about Elizabeth Freeman's will. There was a book, it might have been called All That She Carried. It was
Time
Timeline.
Thank you. And that book was so powerful. There's each part of it helped me to understand things more. And I'm thinking of things like that, if you guys have recommendations.
Well, I've said already Gloria Whiting's book called Belonging, which looks at the sort of situation of enslaved people in Boston, largely Boston. It's also with the Boston area. There's a couple of case studies of Cambridge, I think one on the North Shore. But it really illuminates the kind of horror of slavery in England. Something again that has been largely overlooked or erased.
Belonging is a really excellent recent scholarship. I would also say Dispossessed Lives by Marissa Fuentes. It's not New England specific, but it does a lot of these things we've been talking about historical silences, and a really good argument for what to do with that. Terrible, shameless personal plug. I also published an article on my findings. And if you're interested in that, I published that on Commonplace, the Journal of Early American Life, and it's called Glimpses of Their Lives.
When was that publication?
Commonplace.
When?
When? Early I think February 2025 or late 2024. But it's freely available through their website.
There's also it's a little bit older, but a great book by Joanne Pope Mellish called Disowning Slavery, which talks about the sort of ways in which the North backed away from or repudiated their involvement in slavery.
Then, of course, if I could be shameless, here's my book.
First one I thought of.
I own your book, Jana.
I do book clubs.
And I listened to an audiobook as I drove here today from Boston, so that was great. I would just say I don't have one book to recommend. We have a book section on our website, which is womenshistory.org, so I encourage you to check that out.
Go, Kathy.
That's really needs to wrap up our conversation this evening, but a reminder that our panelists will be here for a few minutes. If you have additional questions, please direct them there. And also be sure to see my colleague Susan Mount at the bookstore pop-up if you'd like tickets to the Mount, or if you're interested in purchasing Jana's book this evening, we have that here. But now, please join me in thanking Marcus and all of our panelists.
Thank you.
Yep.